All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the July 2023 edition of the St. Lawrence County Chamber's Lunch and Learn webinar series. I am Laura Pearson, the Workforce Development Coordinator for the St. Lawrence County Chamber of Commerce. This monthly educational webinar series is made possible by the generous support of St. Lawrence University and Clarkson University, who are leadership circle supporters of the Chamber. I would also like to thank our techie today, Catherine Palaio, who's the Destination Services Manager for the St. Lawrence County Chamber of Commerce, for her tech support and assistance during this webinar. Before I introduce today's presenter, I want to run through a few items. First, your mics have been muted and your webcams have been disabled. But if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type them into the chat window and we will do our best to answer them. Please note that this session is being recorded for the purposes of broadcasting it on our webinar archive and our YouTube channel, which is named SLC Chamber NY. After the presentation is complete, we will open the floor for any Q&A. We do keep the webinars to under an hour so you can get back to work. If you're interested in presenting or have a topic you would like to see us present, please contact us. Our topic today is regulatory aspects of starting a food-based business. There are different agencies and they have their own set of rules or permits. Our presenter will discuss the varying products that can be made with each designation, basic labeling requirements, and share resources for additional information. Please allow me to introduce our presenter, Maria Filippi, Harvest Kitchen Manager and Local Foods Program Leader from the Cornell Cooperative Extension of St. Lawrence County in Canton. Welcome, Flip.
Hey there, everybody. So glad to be with you here today. Thank you, Laura, for that intro. So I will start sharing my screen, but we're gonna cover a lot of ground today. And one thing I want you to know, as the Chamber mentioned, happy to answer follow-up questions at any time. Because food-based businesses, as with many different specific industries, there's a lot of variability depending on the type of thing that you want to make and where you want to sell it and such. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. So I've got a few slides to kind of complement some of the topics I'll be talking about. But just to get a sense, if you haven't heard of the Harvest Kitchen before, we're a shared use incubator kitchen affiliated with Cornell Cooperative Extension of St. Lawrence County. So that means we're here in Canton on the learning farm. So if you've ever been on that sharp curve heading towards Colton on 68 leaving Canton, that's us, the big white barn with the green roof. And about 6 years ago, a portion of that barn was renovated and turned into a commercial kitchen space. So we've got everything from a big kitchen space to a walk-in cooler and freezer and dry goods storage. So we use it for our own programs and workshops. Like next week, we have a preserving herbs workshop, but we also rent it out to other entrepreneurs who might want to dip their toes into starting a food venture, but aren't ready to start or build their own facility yet. And as Laura mentioned, happy to answer questions. You can type them into the chat, or you can unmute and chat about it at the end of the presentation. So I kind of covered this already. One cool thing, and I put these pictures in as a reminder, 2 days a week during the entire school year, the Harvest Kitchen is used for our Fresh Cut program. So we partner with St. Lawrence Louis Bosse's and Big Spoon Kitchen. And they purchase tens of thousands of pounds of local and New York State product that's minimally processed and then goes into area public schools, which is pretty neat. So I'm using lots of photos in the presentation, and I want to give a shout out to those businesses and area producers because they make our food system what it is and create that vibrancy with all their hard work. So today's session, we're going to talk a little bit about why you'd make a food product and your motivation and the types of things you're interested in, some common hurdles for folks, but then the meat of it is really like, who would you be talking to about food products? What's the expectation from whether it's Department of Ag and Markets or Department of Health? And then options for getting that food product made, labeling, and then some kind of party tips. So I'd love it if folks could just type into the chat. You guys disappeared on me. Where's my chat? If folks could just type into the chat if there's a specific thing that you are curious about, whether you're going to start making it yourself or maybe someone's asked you a question, because I think we have some service providers here on the call today. What are there any particular foods that you're most interested in learning about, because the industry is so varied? So we've got someone that's interested in jam, maple and value-added foods, freeze-dried foods. Freeze drying, Jess, is getting really big these days. It seems folks are really, really curious about that. So folks can keep adding those into the chat if they like. We'll just scoot forward. I'm also sort of curious if there's anybody that is thinking about making a product. What is your interest? Why do you want to value add? Somebody's also interested in, it looks like, selling foods at a snack bar. So maybe prepared foods or packaged foods, selling them at a snack bar. So what's the motivation for these value-added foods, whether it's maple or freeze-dried foods, jam or a snack bar? So I work with a lot of farmers as in my role as local food program leader, and there are many, many reasons why someone might value add. So perhaps you're a grower and you have lots and lots of tomatoes, but they're a really perishable product and you want to extend your selling and production season. So one common reason to value add, if you're growing some things, is to extend that season. Maybe you are making it into tomato sauce, or maybe you're dehydrating tomatoes and you want to sell them. So you're able to use more of the food you produce, but you're also able to find new markets and extend beyond just the growing season, which is really, really short here in Northern New York. One person mentioned jam, so that's kind of the same. You might want to add another item onto your market stall if you're selling at farmers market, so you can attract different customers with a variety of foods. A very common one, if someone wants to value add and make a shelf stable item, is just basically allow you to sell more months of the year with a product, essentially, and have your business be relevant and in the community eye for more of the year. So I think this is what y'all are here for today, thinking about, okay, well, I want to make freeze-dried foods, or I want to make jam, or I want to have a snack bar. Those are actually three really good examples because they all have a little bit varying regulatory aspects. So in New York State, we're going to get to a slide about this, but there are multiple entities that would regulate or inspect a business, and it depends specifically on what is the food item that you want to make, but not only what you want to make, but who are you selling to and how. So as a very, very basic example, if you're talking about making jam, maybe you make a blueberry jam and then you want to sell it at a farmer's market. That would be something that you could do right in your own home. But if you want to make jam and then start an e-commerce store where you're selling all across the country, you could no longer make that food product in your home because it's limited to sales right here in New York State. So that's where kind of the nuance of, it's not just the food you want to make, it's who it's being sold at, and then the size of your business. So let's get into some specifics here. So I bet these are some familiar icons to you all when you're thinking about regulation of food products. Sort of the meta umbrella is the Food and Drug Administration across the entire country. And that is sort of the realm where you'll find there's something called the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR, and you'll find a really long list of everything from federal regulations about airline and aeronautics, all the way to dog food, all the way to human food, all the way everything, the Code of Federal Regulations. So there's a part of that Code of Federal Regulations that's specific to human food, and that's where the majority of these rules basically originate from. Like, how are we going to keep the population safe from foodborne illness and outbreaks? And so some of these rules, you might think, why do these even exist, or where did they come from? And at the end of the day, it pretty much all comes down to food safety and reducing the chance that you're going to grow or make or sell something that would make someone else sick. So that's why you might see tracking, record keeping in restaurants where they're getting food to a certain temperature, cooking it, and then you could only sell it if you're hot or cold holding it. So all that stuff relates to making sure we have a safe food supply. We have the USDA that's doing meat and poultry products. And then here in New York State is the lower section where we've got the Department of Health, who's monitoring our restaurants and prepared food vendors, agriculture and markets. We'll talk about the 20C food processing license, and the state liquor authority is something I know a little bit less about, but that also, if you're looking into alcoholic beverages, is who you'd be interacting with. So here's a graph with a boatload of information. But the parts I'd like to note are, so the local health department, those are the folks that are inspecting all of our restaurants in the area. And they're also the folks that are inspecting mobile food trucks. So if there's a person maybe making food in a commissary kitchen and then taking it out on the road to a truck and selling it to the public at a festival or event or fair or something like that, that all falls under the Department of Health. We get into ag and markets, and ag and markets basically is the state on the ground inspectors for the FDA. So many rules originate at the federal level, but the capacity of the federal agencies to actually be in every single community inspecting food businesses is not possible. So basically in New York State, if you, for example, want to make pickles, can them and sell them to the public, you'd fall under New York State ag and markets. The FDA does a lot of other things. And then the USDA over on the right, as I mentioned, is predominantly meat-based things, but it also includes the last bullet. For example, if you, the example of that farmer wanting to take his tomatoes and turn it into tomato sauce, if they wanted to be a meaty tomato sauce and it had more than 2% cooked meat, that would actually then go from ag and markets over to the USDA. So there's a little bit of that. It depends in the nuances of the rules. So let's go into a little bit about, we're talking about who's regulating what, but about the way that food is talked about, like the terms that are used in food. So for example, an acid food is something that already naturally is acidic. So if you think of your citrus or something like that, whereas acidified food, you'd be adding citrus to something else. So maybe you've had dilly beans before that someone in your family has made, that's taking a bean that is not an acidic food and then adding the acidifier, lemon juice or vinegar or something like that, and then making it acidic enough so that it could be safely canned. Water activity controlled is an example of that, would be dehydrating, like jerky or something like that. Low acid, like a vegetable soup or something like that, that would be need a higher temperature to safely can because the pH is kind of high. Fermented acid would be an example, sauerkraut or kimchi or something like that. Many of these foods are shelf stable, but that's just a separate classification. I think folks are familiar with what refrigerated foods are, frozen foods, and then perishable and prepared foods have a lot of overlap. The reason I'm mentioning this list is because usually that will help you figure out where you would fall. So someone might say, okay, well, I want to do value-added maple. And that's just our own terminology, but then we have to figure out what's that classification. And then once we know the classification, then we can figure out who the heck are we going to contact to get more information about what I need to do to legally sell my products to the public. So the maple is a really great example because in New York State, you could have a sugar bush and you could bottle your own maple syrup and you could just sell that directly to the public. But as soon as you take that maple and you want to make a confection and you want to make an additional value-added food beyond that liquid syrup, that's when there's a new layer of rules that would apply because you're value-adding that raw good, which is considered maple, and then making it a value-added food. So one of the folks in the chat mentioned jam, and jam is probably one of the most common things. If you've been to an area farmer's market, you might see folks that have various berry jams. And so that is one of the things that can be made in a home kitchen. So the three things that we're going to cover today most are a home processing registration, a 20C food processing permit, and a Department of Health, or 20C food processing license and a Department of Health permit. And so the home processing registration is something that you can do in your home kitchen. And there is no fee. It's just a simple form that you'd fill out and you would send to New York State, basically. And you could do it online or you could do it by the paper mail. And then you're allowed to just make food in your home. It's just a very, very specific list. And there's a couple restrictions on it. So I mentioned that example of selling jam at the farmer's market versus selling it online throughout the country. You can't do that with a home processing registration. You're not supposed to take commercial equipment and then bring it into your home and increase efficiency and basically be a processing facility, but in your home kitchen. The no product requiring refrigeration is the one that trips people up a lot. An example of that would be you could make a yeasted bread. So you could make kind of your standard loaf of bread, but you wouldn't be able to bake a cheesecake. So baking a cheesecake would mean adding dairy and then needing to keep it at a certain temperature, which is keeping it cool enough so that then there weren't any foodborne illness possibilities. So I think of the home processing being sort of the bulletproof things. Like if you left it in your car all day at a hot farmer's market and then you took it out 5 hours later, you would have no possibility of making someone sick with the food. And that's basically what the home processing is. It's foods that are already totally stable, whether they're dried or canned in the case of jam. And nothing could go wrong if they were possibly mishandled for a short period of time. So home processing is really great for folks if they want to maybe do 2 crusted fruit pies. So you could make apple pies with a bottom layer and a top layer. You could make jams. You could repackage. That's why folks might see repackaged or spice mixes or nut mixes, things like that. Those could all be done at home. But then if you're getting into things with eggs or dairy or require refrigeration, there's a chance that actually wouldn't be possible to make that at home. This is an example of a home kitchen that has this is a company called Parchment. They're out of Troy, New York. So she cranks out a lot of baked goods and crackers and cookies and things like that, all out of her pretty small, modest home kitchen. We have several folks in the area that have home processing registrations. So it need not be an expensive facility. And in fact, it's even sort of intended to not be a commercial facility, and it's somewhat limited by the size and the types of equipment that you have in it. So we've talked about that term kitchen, use the term commercial kitchen, but what does that really mean? Essentially, making sure that food could be produced in a way that would be safe for the public. I show this picture. If you want to see the lights up above, the fixtures, for example, have coverings over them. So, glass couldn't break and then fall into your food. You can see these black things right above the stove. Those basically a fire suppression system, and they have a hood for ventilation. I don't have the 3-bay sink in this, but that would be an example of being able to adequately wash, rinse, and sanitize everything that all of the dishes that you're doing, et cetera. So there's certain things, it doesn't need to be all a sea of stainless steel, but there's certain things that's kind of written into general expectations that if you're building a facility, it has to kind of have X, Y, and Z to make sure that it can produce safe food, but it's easy to clean and maintain. So commercial kitchen is a very general term, but there's a million different types. There's many, many different types of commercial kitchens. So the harvest kitchen that I mentioned is a shared use kitchen. Shared use and incubator is basically cousins, because shared use is essentially multiple vendors might use the same space to make their own food products. An incubator kitchen also offers other technical services and things like that. So there's some overlap with those. Maybe there's workshops throughout the year helping people figure out their costs or how much to sell a product for, marketing and developing. That's what an incubator kitchen is. A co-packer might be someone where maybe instead of you making your jam, you're going to send all your berries to someone else, and then they're going to make the jam, label it, get it back to you, and you're going to sell it. A food hub may or may not have a kitchen. There are places downstate basically where you could sell through them and have distribution, but they also have commercial kitchen space. You could have a commercial kitchen space on farm. There are a couple places here in St. Lawrence County that have their own 20C food processing license and have commercial kitchens on site. An accelerator is also related a little bit to an incubator, but it's the idea that it's a commercial facility that specifically has the goal of getting food businesses up and going, and then within 12 or 24 months they've grown X%, so getting them really through the process at those beginning stages really quickly. The commissary is what would be required of every single mobile venue. So if you see a food truck out and about in St. Lawrence County, whether you're at the fair or at the craft food and wine show, those folks can do limited food, the preparation and service on their truck, but they always are tied back to a physical facility, and that's called their commissary. So the Harvest Kitchen is a commissary for several mobile vendors, so they can serve all out and about everywhere, but certain things happen in their commercial space, which is called a commissary. We don't have any ghost kitchens, but it's popping up, especially with COVID, really rampant in metro areas where there's lots of different vendors that all make food, but it's being either delivery services or it's being served elsewhere. And then community facilities, an example might be a church or a community center or something like that that has a commercial kitchen. So it's not a one size fits all term. The only thing that ties them together is that they follow certain expectations for building and maintenance so that it can safely produce food for the public. So this is the one that is this covers a really wide swath of things. So for the New York State Ag and Markets 20C food processing license, this would cover all of the acidified and canned foods. It would cover all of the dehydrated foods. It would cover the freeze-dried foods that Jess was mentioning. So this is considered food processing, and then the Department of Health is food preparation. So if you think of restaurants being prepared foods, their Department of Health, food trucks being prepared foods, something someone buys and eats hot right away, they're enjoying it. Those are prepared foods. And this is basically food processing. There is some gray area that we don't have time to get into today, but that's basically the separate designation. So if you want to make a canned or fermented product, or anything that's not allowed on that home processing list, you would be doing it with a 20C food processing license. So this is a little screenshot of the application. It's a 2-page application. The fee depends on the type of facility. So you can see that there's no fee for the first 2 years if you're in a place like the Harvest Kitchen or any other shared use incubator facility. If you are a small scale processor, which would be the majority of folks, I think, that would be on this call with no more than 10 full-time employees, it would cost $175 in your own facility. And then if you're above that 10 full-time employees, then it'd be $400 every 2 years. So you would pay New York State Ag and Markets $400 every 2 years to keep your 20C license. And when you have an active 20C license, basically, you've applied, you get a pre-inspection. So every time we have a new vendor coming to the Harvest Kitchen that wants to do something that would fall under food production, our local inspector's name is Greg Cuthbert. He would come over, he would meet them here. He would want to know what do they want to make, how do they want to make it, how often, where are they selling it? And then they'd look at their commercial space, which in this case is the Harvest Kitchen. So they would check to make sure we had the adequate ventilation and sanitary conditions. And then they'd be conditionally approved to start making their food, basically. When they're making their food, if you've ever heard of a scheduled process or approved recipes, certain things would be required to be approved beforehand. So if you wanted to make those dilly beans we were talking about earlier, not only would you get the 20C food processing license, but you would also send that recipe off to somebody that job is to basically look at recipes and make sure they're formulated properly. And then you get that approval and you'd show Greg, our inspector, your scheduled process, aka approved recipe. And then every time you make those dilly beans, whether you're making 7 quarts of them or an entire pallet of them, every shift you're going to follow that recipe. You're going to track the pH. You're going to track the temperature of the brine. Those are probably the safeguards for that type of recipe. And you're going to label it properly. So there's a kind of a few things that are expected every time you're making it. So if there was, hopefully not, but if there was ever an instance where someone was getting sick or they're trying to trace it to your product, you could go all the way back to your record keeping and say, on January 14th, I made this batch, it's labeled with this number, and they could find that food and make sure you were kind of following the safe protocols of your approved recipe. I don't want this to sound intimidating, but I also don't want it to sound wildly easy, because there are a few things that do take some time. So I think if you're thinking about starting a food business, give yourself lots of time, because there's lots of steps to sort of go through, and the growing pains of the first year or two are absolutely real. The Department of Health permit. So this is the one, like I was mentioning, all our mobile vendors would have it. all of our temporary food service places that would have it, like a pop-up one day, you know, at a market or an event, and then all of our restaurants. In addition, they also inspect beaches and campgrounds and things like that. But they're also the folks that look into water quality, and you'd send your tests to make sure you had adequate water. So the good news for people that live in St. Lawrence County is actually, or in Canton, is that we have the district office right here in Canton. You could call them on the phone, you could stop by, you could email them. The principal sanitarian is Joanna Clifford Allard, and she would be she's the one that knows the most stuff about food, and she could answer any question about the regulations online from the Department of Health about permitting or your idea and getting that submitted for approval. If you were doing this route, so in the example of a food truck, basically they would do something similar. You would apply, you would show that you had clean, safe water, you would tell them the kind of food you wanted to make, and you'd have a pre-inspection where they want to see where are you making the food, what are you making, and where is it being served if it's offsite, if it's not a restaurant. And then they'd either conditionally approve you, or they'd want to see maybe a couple things get fixed. Like, for example, if you have fridges, but you don't have a temperature keeping, a way to see like what is the temperature of the food in that fridge. They'd want to make sure you have a few things in place before you actually start making and selling food to the public. This one I'm not going to spend as much time on because I don't think it applies to the folks on this call necessarily. But the USDA is, for example, if you wanted to, you were raising beef and you wanted to have them processed and then you want to sell those cuts to someone else, you would either have to have an approved USDA facility right there on your farm, or you would have to send those animals to a place that was a USDA approved facility. So a local example of that would be Tri-Town Meats in Brazier Falls, or Red Barn Meats down Krogan Way. They're a little bit few and far between, and this is even more expensive, I'd say, to start the infrastructure. But meat and dairy egg products have the highest possibility of foodborne illness and contamination, and so that's something that's pretty highly regulated. It's very possible and people do it, but there's quite a few steps to kind of go through to make sure that you're able to safely produce those foods. So I just wanted to cover, I know we're getting to the Q&A point in a minute, but I just want to mention there are a lot of ways. So if someone has a goal of selling you make a delicious recipe and you want to sell it to somebody, there's a lot of ways to get there. So maybe you are using your home kitchen, maybe you are eventually building or renovating your own space, but you could be renting out a space from an incubator, but you could also go the private labeling or co-packer route. Let's see. Yeah. So the co-packer route would be where you're providing that raw product to someone else and they're actually making it. So there's a lot of ways to get to the point where you might be selling food to the public, and they don't all involve you physically value adding the food. I'm mentioning this part because I think that what I hear from food entrepreneurs when they're starting, usually the core of the idea is they have something really delicious and they want to sell it to other people, which is a beautiful reason to start a food business. Just keep in mind that there's a lot of other aspects in terms of receiving orders or packing orders or having office space or having maintenance fees for kitchen stuff. So just be mindful. Somebody like Jennifer McCluskey on the call, providing technical service through small business development or getting a sense of the costs, because there's a lot of your time will be chewed up with not making food, whether it's communicating with vendors or record keeping or branding and creating your labels. There's a lot of other things that will take a bunch of time. I'm going to scoot beyond this one because we're going to get into the labeling. So for labels, this is an example of a label. So you can see down below, I wrote principal display panel and information panel. And the reason I wrote those, that's the way that it's written in the FDA food code. Some labels only have that very central part, like they're not as broad of a label. If it's a bigger food company, it's more likely to have a left central and right display panel, but you might just have one little label, and that means everything would have to be crammed all into one little section. But this is a very common way. So in the very first part, you absolutely have to have what it is. So it's called the statement of identity, but on the very front, if you have more than one display panel, you have to have what it is and how much is in there. So this whole thing at the bottom where they wrote plant-based and no artificial additives, that's just their marketing terms that they want you to care about, and they want you to buy the thing, but that has nothing to do with any legal expectations about labeling. But the right display panel has a lot of really important things. So if you only have one display panel, these things on the right also need to be in the center all at once. So you have to always have your ingredient list. So in descending order of predominance. So if you're making a maple peanut butter and the ingredients are peanut butter and maple syrup, peanut butter would be first, maple syrup would be second, maybe salt would be third, for example. So you can't put them in the order of just the things that you grow on your farm that you want people to know about. You have to always put them in so someone knows from most to least what's in there. The allergen declaration, the 8 major allergens actually just got switched to 9 because sesame was added. Name and address of manufacturer, so who's making it and where. And the no intervening material means that, like I mentioned, the plant-based and no artificial additives, you can't put your marketing terms or your other stuff in between this legal stuff right there. So you can't have ingredients and then be like, we love plants between it and then say your distribution production point, because they're basically seeing that section as the legally required material, and they don't want you to be putting all that fluffy stuff that will help people buy more of your product in there. I think I need to wrap up, I believe, Laura. Laura, I'm surprised Laura hasn't told me to stop talking yet, but I just wanted to mention kind of before answering questions that there's a lot of there's sort of lots of moving pieces. There are folks in the community, they're happy to help, whether it's me or the Small Business Development Center, or at Clarkson, the Shipley Center for Innovation, or downstate, the Cornell Food Venture Center, or Cornell Small Farms. There are lots of people that have information and you can kind of piece it together, but just give yourself the time to do that so that it is a fun and interesting process for you. And you're not always feeling like you're sweating bullets, because I do recognize that there are quite a few different hurdles and it just takes time to kind of problem solve those. Skipping. Oh yes, I would like, Catherine, if we could give them this. I'd like to hear if there are other things people want included in this, or if they're how it went for them. So I guess I should copy and paste that in there. And I think maybe Catherine or Laura will share these other resources with you. There's a few different cool guides. The Guide to Small Scale Food Entrepreneurship is New York State specific, and was done by the Cornell Food Venture Center. The Massachusetts one's not New York State specific, but they do a really good job with branding and marketing section of their guide. And then the first one is something I put together, just of lots and lots of different links. So if you don't like spreadsheets, you shouldn't click on that one, because it's got a lot of info in there. So I think that's all. Thank you so much for your time. I'm happy to answer questions.
I'm going to wrap up my section. Catherine's going to turn the recording off, and then we'll open the floor up for questions. If you just give us a few seconds. Flip, that was awesome. You had so much information in there. I would like to thank the Clarkson University and St. Lawrence University for their support in sponsoring the webinar series. Follow and like our Facebook page and stay up to date with what's happening in the Chamber. To register for our next webinar, which will be scheduled in August, stay tuned for the eBlast announcement coming soon. We encourage you to view our other webinars in the Lunch and Learn series by going to slcchamber.org and clicking Archived Webinars in the right-hand menu, or go to our YouTube channel, search for SLC Chamber NY. Also, if you know of any business that would benefit from membership in the St. Lawrence County Chamber of Commerce, please do refer them to us. We can be reached at 315-386-4000 and info@slcchamber.org. Interested businesses can also learn about our benefits and apply for membership at www.slcchamber.org. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great afternoon. Now we're going to turn the recording off and open up the floor for Q&A. Okay. Is there anything in the chat? Did somebody put something in the chat? Oh, Flip has got her Cornell survey. If you could please go on to that later and do the survey, that would be awesome. Do we have any questions? You can unmute yourself and ask your questions, or you can put them in the chat.
Yeah, so it sounds like Jess is wondering about prepared food, including cold food as well as hot. I'm curious if you mean a specific type of food. Um, so it could include cold food, but it would probably, do you have an example, Jess, that you're thinking of? Like, I guess if you're talking about
Salsa,
fresh,
fresh
okay,
salsa. Yeah.
yeah, salsa is a good example. So if you were vending at a place and you wanted to make tacos and then put your own fresh salsa on it, that would be prepared food, and it would be food service essentially. So it would be Department of Health food service permit.